All right, so welcome to today's webinar for communities and civil society. If we could put the next slide up, Conte, with the agenda for today. We have incorporated a lot of speakers in our agenda today. We felt this was really important because this topic is evolving around the PPPR FIF, or the FIF for Pandemic Prevention, Preparedness and Response. And so we felt it was important to make sure that colleagues felt that they had a base understanding of what the PPPR FIF is, where it is at right now, and where it is headed in the next few months, so that we can then have conversations about what is the PPPR FIF that we would like to see as communities and civil society. What are our priorities that we may want to focus collaborations, actions, and work on over the next few months together. So as we said, the call is being recorded, and it will be posted with all of the materials on the GFAN website, and we'll be sharing lots of links in the chat today so that you can all go and look at those at any time. We do seem to have difficulty content at the moment seeing the screen. So if you are able to maybe move the PowerPoint, there we go. So you can see the agenda in front of you. The webinar function means that we have a Q&A as well as a chat, and we really invite participants to use the Q&A through the conversation, because we have done our best to have time for discussion today. We all know that there's a lot to say and a lot that people want to impart, and so we want to make sure that we leave some space for ongoing conversation through the Q&A and the chat function as well. And so first and foremost, to start us off, I think a thank you to my colleagues from the organizations that you see listed here below on the agenda. In various ways over the past sort of 6 to 8 months, we have been collaborating to ensure that civil society and community voices are heard through the various conversations and iterations of documents and consultations around what I call the new and shiny pandemic preparedness efforts, whether it's been at the WHO or the Global Fund's role, or conversations around FIFs or security threats councils, pandemic treaties, etc. So I wanted to thank and recognize all of the co-organizers of this webinar, whose logos you can see there, and who have been actively recruiting and inviting many of you to join us today. Conte, if we could move to the next slide, please. The objectives for today with all of your with all of you, is to ensure that we share a basic understanding of what this PPR FIF is, hear from colleagues about some of the key principles around community and civil society engagement and participation, and building on lessons from our work as advocates in various fields and in the ACT Day platform. We want to try and leave the call with a clearer sense about what the PPR FIF that we want to see should be, the principles that should underlie it, and some sense of how we go forward to collectively from here. I don't think we're going to have all of the answers or like a clear action plan at the end of this call, but I'm hoping that we're closer to that and can see our way to some collaborations and some work together. We have before, if we could go to the next slide, please, Conte. We have seen top-down mechanisms in preparedness fail before, and I think we still have an opportunity to shape this effort. When they made the decision, some of you may have seen this on our Twitter recently, but when they made the decision to move forward with the PPR FIF on June 30th, the press release noted that through July and August, they will continue the engagement process with CSO partners, recipient countries, and other stakeholders for inputs to the design. But as others have noticed in various places in commentary, including my favorite piece this week, thus far from Asia Russell and Emily Bass, called Fix It or Forget It, published in Think Global Health, there was so little movement between the first draft and the final working draft that it feels difficult to believe that there is strong enough will to back up the intention to engage CSOs in meaningful ways. Over 2/3 of the comments to the white paper called for inclusive governance, or specifically for civil society presence on the board. And yet in the final draft that was discussed and adopted, civil society is mentioned only twice, and you can see the quote there in terms of a dedicated process for CSO engagement. To help us throughout this webinar, we are going to be using a number of different Slidos to create word clouds and polls to try and engage you in this conversation as we go through this. So please be keeping an eye for that in the chat. But so that I don't take up any more time at all from the precious time that we do have, the first part of our agenda today, to help us understand a little bit more about the background and the opportunities that the FIF presents, and that is being worked upon and hoped for launch as early as September, in the fall at least. We'll be hearing from Cecilia Mudakasha from UNF, Anton O'Field-Kerr from Equal International, and Diane Stewart from the Global Fund. To save time, I'm going to be popping in short bios of colleagues into the chat as we introduce people. Or looks like we've popped in everyone's bio, or just mine, which still contains a silly reference to some work I once did in a farmer's field. But we will be popping in bios for everyone. And Cecilia, I'm going to pass it over to you for our background. We'll have an opportunity for discussion after Cecilia, and then we'll move to Anton and Diane and further opportunity for discussion before moving on to the second part of our webinar. Cecilia, thank you so much for joining us, and I'll pass it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Katie, and thank you to all. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. I am Cecilia Mudakasha from the United Nations Foundation, and I just want to, I'm going to share my screen because I have prepared a few slides for you. But just to share briefly that before joining the UN Foundation, was actually with the National Academies for several years, and actually being fortunate to have been in the process that actually led to the FIF since the beginning, in terms of supporting the secretariat that helped the G20 high-level independent panel work on a report that came out with a recommendation for establishing this mechanism. So in some ways, this process, which everybody started hearing about just recently, has started a while ago. So I am just going to say that, as Katie mentioned, there is a lot of moving pieces right now, and I'm going to move to, yeah. And so just wanted to make sure that, things change, and there is a lot of conversations, weekly discussions on this. So what I share today might change, and there are some things that are still being sorted out. And as Katie mentioned too, there's an opportunity still to shape this process. So just as quickly as background, as you know, the World Bank Board of Directors approved unanimously the establishment of the FIF, but also approved the role of the World Bank, which is as trustee, secretariat, and implementing partner for this FIF. You'll see there the list of funding donors. There are others expected to fund the FIF and make commitments as early as this week, from what I heard. So as I just mentioned in my starting comments, the FIF was proposed by this high-level independent panel that was mandated by the G20 under Italy's presidency. They were established in January, and the report came out in July. And so through that process, under Italy's presidency, the Rome Leaders Declaration in October established the Joint Finance and Health Task Force with a mandate to assess the proposal for establishing a FIF. So under Indonesia's presidency, they committed to continue working on this, and they co-chaired with Indonesia this joint task force, and they established a secretariat led by WHO and supported by the World Bank. So after several months and meetings, as you know, the task force have met several times. They have several papers that they prepared analyzing gaps and proposals. The G20 countries in April recommended establishing and asking the World Bank to start the process for establishing this FIF. So you've all seen the white paper that came out to the public in May, seeking public comments. Large number of comments. They are posted on the World Bank's website over a very short period of time. Consultations were held, and this is a list that I got from the bank on what they've done so far, and that in terms of, some of them you participated on, like the Pan-Virtual meeting in May, but also there's been hybrid events along the margins of the World Health Assembly, the Global Fund Secretariat Conference in May, and some other engagements. And the World Bank and WHO have reached out to their different offices in countries to talk about this new proposal. So just very quickly to mention that there are 6 principles for what the STIF established. And so what I like to say that, you know, on paper and the purpose of this mechanism, you know, is truly valuable if it's actually gets to be implemented under these principles, because it is set to complement the work of existing institutions like the Global Fund, to catalyze funding beyond ODA sources, to serve as an integrator and provide this platform for pandemic preparedness, and give the flexibility to work through a number of institutions, and done with inclusivity and transparency and accountability. The areas, well, this FIF will finance are still to be determined. What the new concept paper, you know, shares and the current view, as far as I hear, is that country capacity is going to be, you know, what they want to prioritize in different areas. And I would just like to add too that potentially manufacturing capacity will be one of those. That's something that is very, that is of high interest of middle and low income countries. But at the same time, there's a potential opportunity to also strengthen regional and global capacities. So the proposed structure as it is now, and it has not been finalized, is a governing board, you know, that will basically decide what, you know, who receives, based on the applications that receive, who will be receiving the financing from this FIF, a technical advisory panel where they expect the WHO to play an important role, and the implementing entities. As you all know, traditionally, FIFs allow only MDBs and UN agencies to be recipients, but as far as I know, it is very, very likely that Global Fund, CEPI, and Gavi will be implemented entities for this FIF. And also working very closely, they are working very closely with WHO and the G20 task force. So what are the next steps? There is a core FIF design team comprised by the founding donors, WHO, World Bank, and the G20 task force co-chairs. They meet weekly to establish timeline and process for the operations and actually set up a governance body. The goal is to launch the FIF on September 30th. And they also want to have a governance body ready, a staff secretariat, and what they call a governance and operations manual for the FIF. They are working on response letter to entities that provided feedback to the white paper in May, June. They're planning, as far as they've shared with me, a couple of workshops with CSOs and LMICs in late July, early August. And they have promised that they will make this public, open to the public, and post it on their website. And once, of course, the FIF is launched, they will make these documents public. So that's what I have in terms of like background and latest information, but I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you especially for being quick with your comments today. We really appreciate that's a lot of information. And again, we will be sharing that with everyone. We will be sharing that with everyone on the GFAN website, along with the recording and information from this call. So just a reminder to everyone that the chat function isn't the best place for any questions that you want to pose to the speakers or to other colleagues here. So please use the Q&A, and I can see that we've got one going there, but this is also an opportunity at the moment to pose some questions to Cecilia. I know that we're limited in terms of the function here of the webinar style of Zoom call, but would invite anyone who does have questions, that includes other speakers or panelists. If you do have a question, to please pop that into the Q&A chat, and we will try to address those questions here quickly and or through the Q&A. Sorry, through the Q&A that I keep trying to call a chat, but it's actually the Q&A, and I'm trying to be distinct and give good instructions. So Cecilia, there's a couple of questions there already around the lack of reference to civil society as an implementer, and wondering whether or not you have, and the term affected community being not a part of much of the documentation there. And I'm wondering if you have any sense of those kinds of conversations that are taking place around some of those terms and how that might be incorporated into the structure or some of the consultations. It's a great question.
Yes. So from what I heard directly from the bank and several of the funding donors is that they heard loud and clear. I mean, despite unfortunately the paper doesn't make enough reference, they heard loud and clear the voice of civil society, and they're going to discuss it to see whether there's an opportunity to include them as part of their governing body. This is something that definitely it's in terms of so what we're seeing here, and so I just try to explain a little bit, is there are mechanisms like the FIF that have been established along the way. And, for instance, the Global Fund is a FIF. And so it is something very flexible and can be shaped to what the founding donors and ultimately the governance body does. So when it launches in September, there's opportunities for it to be changed. So it's not the end of the story, and we're not just having this, like weeks to go and do something. There are going to be further consultations after September 30th, and still an opportunity to push for what we really want from this mechanism. So what I have heard so far is, for instance, in terms of the implementing agencies, the Global Fund Secretariat and Gavi are given, but there's a number of global health organizations that want to also be recipients. So there has to be a process to determine that, and that's something that's same. But with going back to your question, Katie, about civil society, they are in active conversations about that. And we are hoping that, if you continue pushing and making your voice loud, and I know there's going to be, as I said, the World Bank is preparing response letters to the comments. They have committed to engage civil society during this period of time, so late July, early August. So I think there's going to be an opportunity to push even stronger now that they know that this decision for the governance body has to be made quickly, right? So at this time, that doesn't mean that it cannot change, but there has to be a setup of a governing body for this entity to be launched.
Thanks, Cecilia. And I think the other sort of element of that question around civil society engagement is civil society and communities as implementers. Obviously, the FIF itself will have some restrictions in terms of, which organizations can be implementers, but can you speak to whether or not that's been a part of the conversation as well? That's a very specific question from a colleague in the Q&A around plans or next steps to get funds to community-based organizations and research organizations. Would that be via like the implementing agencies, presumably? But if you could speak to that, that would be helpful. And then I think we'll wrap up and move on from there.
Okay, excellent. Yes, so that will mainly be through the implementing entities, and I think that's what I was just currently mentioning, whether there's an opportunity for civil society to really advocate for entities that work very closely with them. So I see that as the next step to work on and advocate for, and I say that in reference to how FIFs work. So they have these organizations that has to be approved, have to be vetted from the World Bank perspective. Just because over the 27 other FIFs they had several issues in terms of, any, use of money. They are responsible. They are the trustee of that money. So they have to be very careful on a process that not only, of course, does what it's set to do in terms of making sure that the money goes where it needs to be, but also to be fair to, and to be open and fair to other, say, organizations that are going to receive the money. So I see it more as an opportunity to actually advocate for implementing entities at the global health or regional level. That's another thing that's being considered. Regional organizations as recipients as well. But that seems like in the process of discussions a little later in terms of just right now, I think that conversations about Global Fund Secretariat and Gavi are pretty advanced. And I think that's very likely to happen more in the shorter term than maybe the inclusion of other entities such as regional organizations.
Well, thank you very much. There's a bit of a lively questions coming into the chat and more coming into the Q&A. But unfortunately, if you post your question in the chat, not everyone can see it. So we are asking people to put comments, questions in the chat, in the Q&A function, which you should see as a separate from the chat. And please consider typing an answer, adding to questions that are already there. For time reasons, we are going to move on, but Cecilia, and to colleagues, just to say that it is clear that there's a lot of concern around where civil society will land as equal partners, as implementers, and how all of this will be figured out, and concern that if we don't get movement and get improvements in this stage where it's being implemented, that it will be more difficult to change later, frankly. I mean, I think that's, I think that's what people feel, and, just in general. Cecilia, I'm just going to point you to a question from Robin Montgomery around any intelligence or just any general comments you could share around who is actively talking about civil society engagement within these conversations, to the best of your knowledge. World Bank, WHO, the founding funders of the FIF, and if you could answer and provide any information, that would be super helpful. So thank you very much, Cecilia. And I know you're staying with us through this webinar, so please continue to keep an eye on that Q&A. And now that you're not speaking, hopefully have a chance to type in some responses. So
yes, thank you.
Thank you. So I'm now going to turn to Anton Ofield-Kerr. We're going to pop a short bio of Anton into the chat so that you know who he is, but he's with Equal International and is here today to talk to us a little bit about the concept of global public investment and how that could influence how we advocate and what we talk for and look for within this FIF. So Anton, over to you.
Hi there, Katie, and hi everyone. Just to double check that you can see me and you can see the presentation. Yeah, great. So thanks for the invite to help do this webinar. For those of you know, I'm Anton, Director of Equal International. In this presentation, which I want to try and keep short, I want to do a quick introduction to GPI, so Global Public Investments, piece of work that we've been supporting the co-creation of for some time, talk about the progress so far on GPI, a piece of work that we did on consultation on pandemic preparedness and response in relation to GPI, the GPI principles in relation to the FIF and some key recommendations, and our current thinking in relation to, and it relates to the previous speaker talking about how do we shape the FIF and what opportunities are there, and essentially a phased approach to the FIF. So on the call will be a number of GFAN members, and the initial work that we did on GPI kind of stemmed out of some work that was initiated by Peter. Peter, I think you're on the call as well, which was actually looking at the Global Fund and the challenges of the Global Fund governance and allocation, particularly with transitioning, and what that highlighted was whilst the Global Fund is a great model of governance with the amount of participation and ownership, it still struggles with the fact that it fits within an ODA model where you've got specific donors and specific recipients, and doesn't, basically, even the governance structure doesn't have a space for emerging countries that emerge as potential donors, and particularly in relation to middle-income countries, and how rapidly they can become ineligible for funding when HIV, TB, malaria epidemics, as well as inequality, remain the same. So our initial work was instigated by looking at this problem where there are limitations both in where funds can be generated under the model, because it's very north-south donor recipient focused, but also where funds can be distributed, because the ODA model says once you reach upper middle income status, then you're not really eligible for funding. And that's led to many issues around transitioning we've all been involved in. In the broader development sphere, there's an acknowledgement that because of its unique characteristics, there's still a need for concessional international finance, and that's critical, that basically we need a lot more public money, not less. But also that the way that funds are raised and distributed, we need a fairer governance kind of structure, we need a new narrative. And so the work that we've done, it's now over 7 years, has gone through a process of consolidating thinking around what we think is the problem with the architecture of aid that then affects institutions like the Global Fund, and now also affects the thinking in relation to something like the FIF. So why is this work relevant to the FIF and relevant to the Global Fund? GPI, as you'll see, is articulated, basically proposes a transformative approach to financing global public goods. And you will see in a way how it's linked to pandemic preparedness and response. GPI presents a great opportunity for the reform of global health architecture, how we think about it, and the principles that have emerged through this co-creation process, which essentially our starting point was our history of working on the principles of nothing about us without us, you know, that those affected by policies should be involved in creating them. For GPI, the principles of fair governance through universal principles have emerged as essentially a commitment that all should contribute, all should decide, all should benefit. So again, unlike the donor-recipient model, all countries should contribute, all should decide, and all should benefit. And that has implications, as we'll see when you have a discussion about the FIF. The Global Fund governance is probably the closest example of a GPI governance model. You know, it's still progressive compared to other models. And again, what's been proposed by the FIF demonstrates how basically how archaic the thinking is when it comes to governance models, and how far they are from what we've won and practice in relation to the Global Fund. And essentially what we say is GPI principles are necessary for implementing an effective and an equitable pandemic preparedness and response. So just very quickly to say that the journey in relation to GPI has been over 7 years of constant consultation and co-creation, where we went through a process where we brought many together to do a thought leaders retreat, and that was after quite a few round tables and papers and discussions at GFAN meetings. You'll see what was articulated in 2019 was what we call the 5 paradigm shifts, which I'll go through. We've had a number of different working groups, and 2 years ago we established an expert working group that brought together a diverse group of academics, NGOs, think tank, and thinkers, implementers, to help to work through how GPI could be technically feasible and politically viable. The working group, many of you would have seen the global consultation on the expert working group that was run the second half of last year. And the final recommendations of the expert working group will be launched on the 27th of this month, and we can share an invite to that. So in short, GPI calls for these 5 paradigm shifts, from a narrow focus on reducing poverty to the broader challenges of addressing inequality and sustainability. When it comes to function, it calls for a kind of a paradigm shift from seeing international public investment as a temporary thing, as a quick thing, to actually something to be valued as a permanent force for good. So long-term investment and long-term solutions and challenges. In summary, the geography, as I mentioned, rather than being north-south, to a universal effort, and we already see so much south-south collaboration going on, and countries working in collaboration outside of an ODA model. So it's already happening. And then governance from an outdated post-colonial institution to representative decision-making. So a lot of the institutions that we see are the product of a Bretton Woods or post-Bretton Woods architecture. And again, that got illustrated by the FIF and the proposition around the governance around the FIF. And then when it comes to the paradigm shift around narrative, from patronizing language of foreign aid, from donors to recipients, to an empowering multilateralism and work towards a common endeavor. And then in all of the complexity of international financing that GPI tries to work through, it's really helped by it comes down to these core principles that under a GPI approach, all countries should contribute to a big global challenge, according to their ability to pay. The investments can be geographic or thematic. All countries should benefit according to their need. And the decision-making and the governance should be like a Global Fund Plus model where there is basically a shared governance structure. We were asked to do a thought piece, which was to say, well, if we took GPI and applied it to pandemic preparedness and response, what would that look like? And so last year we brought again together and co-created a process where we brought this group of kind of, you'll recognize many of them, and went through again through a 6-month process, examining what were the challenges with the current pandemic preparedness and response. And if we took a GPI approach to it, what would that add? We ended up, there's a paper that we can share, but in summary, what the consolidated were the key pillars of what a good pandemic preparedness and response requires: investment in prevention and resilience, in access and in coordination. And when we take that, it meant that when the white paper for the FIF came up, we were able to work with GFAN, with STOPAIDS, with with various networks on this call to do a very quick critique and response. And from our perspective, that was a GPI critique, which highlighted the key recommendations that we collectively identified, that when it comes to the FIF, what's really important is inclusive governance. The FIF implements a governance structure that recognizes and ensures the meaningful participation of countries of all income levels, non-state actors, starting with communities and NGOs. That society, low-income countries, upper-income countries have a stake in decision-making on the FIF. That the design process is participatory, consultation process where WHO, World Bank and governments work with civil society communities to co-create the operation and governance of new FIF. And then operations, prioritization and scope, that the bank should involve current ACT partners, such as the Global Fund, Gavi, FINE, CEPI, UNITAID, as implementing partners alongside relevant multilateral stakeholders, technical agencies, civil society, regional organizations, and the others. What we've come to, probably now thinking in the last week or so, is in the FIF, we've got this dynamic where, due to the US politics and timelines for when funds need to be allocated, there's this huge rush to get the FIF established. And that means that it's a rush to do a bodge job, to do something that doesn't live up to what we need. What we're proposing is that there should be a 2-phased approach to implementing the FIF. That the ultimate goal is that we have a transformative impact on global pandemic preparedness and response, that the development of the FIF should not be rushed over the summer, the next 2-3 months. That it should be designed in a 2-phase process from the start. So phase 1 should be proof of concept and building phase 2. Phase 2 should be transformative for impact. So yeah. So what we would aim is that the funds make initial pandemic response investments that immediately contribute to improving the world's ability for pandemic preparedness and response, and identify the highest potential operating models for input and scale into second phase. And our suggestion is that there's a timeline of 2 years in the first stage of it. Year 1, broad co-creation to identify transformative design for phase 2, and the final negotiations for a formal launch of stage 2 of the second phase. And then the aim in a second phase is to generate unprecedented levels of resources for unprecedented number of breadth of public and private, from unprecedented number and breadth of public and private contributors, to achieve an unprecedented level of excellence in program design, implementation through co-creation, ownership of programs by countries and communities. And that works towards having impact beyond 2030. So basically we're saying that if you do it well, you can have a game-changing level of protection from pandemic preparedness, but that requires a GPI approach and nothing about us without us approach, but pragmatically a 2-phased approach, because just accepting the reality of what needs to be done in the next few months versus what we want, which is as we had in the Global Fund, a long period of multi-stakeholders designing a fund that's ambitious and that works. That's it for me. Thanks, Katie. I hope I kept to my
not quite, but I think you got to some really interesting things there, and I can see some comments about not rushing the FIF, and I think it's really interesting these last few slides that you've shown with a suggestion in terms of how to phase sort of the roll-in of the work. We're just popping up here now as we move to our next speaker before we come back to some opportunity for answering questions. And Anton, I just point out the chat, there's a few sort of questions and comments around what you've put, including, to what extent the GPI approach is being picked up in the conversations, and some concerns around fiscal space for low and middle income countries to be contributing additional dollars to like external places as opposed to internal domestic budgets. So just wanting to show everyone, it looks like people go from skeptical, concerned, devastated to feeling cautiously optimistic, hopeful, and concerned around sort of this idea of pandemic preparedness. So and the fact that there's more interest in funding in it. So I guess we're feeling the range of emotions in our support group for each other here globally around this, and we'll continue to work to try and find ways that we can turn more of those into positive sort of actions and positive feelings about what at least we're doing together around the PPPR FIF. So Diane Stewart, we're going to pop in a short bio of you into the chat, and we're going to turn over to you next. And I just wanted to point out, Diane, before you begin to speak, is there are some questions that are already popping up in the Q&A and the chat around how we can guarantee the role of the Global Fund, with its baked in existing priorities for integrating communities and civil society. So really looking forward to hearing from you around, the Global Fund's work within this PPPR FIF sort of space and how that continues to evolve, especially since the June 30th decision and the moving forward of this proposal. So Diane, over to you.
Thanks, Katie, and thanks. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here and great to participate in this discussion, which has been taking up a surprising amount of our time this year. My apologies, I don't have any sexy slides like the others, not least because there's a few other things going on at the fund at the moment, as I'm sure you're aware. But I hope to share something useful with you in terms of how we're thinking about the new FIF and what we've been advocating for. So maybe first, let me just lay out some of the landscape around how the Global Fund sees its role in PPPR, and then talk a little bit about the positions we've been taking in regards to the FIF as it currently exists. So I'll be brief because you're all very familiar with the Global Fund, and I think we've had this conversation a few times over the last 2 years. But just a reminder that the Global Fund remains the largest investor in grant funding for resilient and sustainable systems for health, which include community systems and which include community health systems as well as community systems. We expend over $1 billion a year on that right now in terms of our current expenditure. And during the last 2 years, we've expended over $4 billion in the current pandemic response to COVID-19. So we're already in the space, we're already doing what we do, and we're already financing many of the things that you've been talking about in the chat, which relate to community systems, community health workers, community engagement around things like IPC and other ways of sort of protecting communities from outbreaks of infection, and a lot of the testing infrastructure that's been used over the last 2 years for the COVID-19 response is basically the result of 20 years of investment in testing for other infectious diseases, AIDS, TB, and malaria. So I think we all know that there's a long history of us investing in building up these resilient systems, and then we double down to show how we could respond pretty fast and pretty nimbly to the current response, and get funding for testing, PPE and other things out much more quickly than anyone else managed to do. That might sound like a bit of a pitch for the Global Fund. I apologize, I'm in replenishment mode. I think we can all agree that it has been a very robust response built on the relationships we have with the implementing organizations in national governments, but also in civil society in over 130 countries around the world. Our new strategy also takes this into account. So the new strategy is hoping to save 20 million lives, and by addressing most particularly AIDS, TB, and malaria, but by building up the kinds of systems that will address infectious diseases more broadly. And we anticipate that of the $18 billion that we are expecting to raise for the new strategy, the first 3 years of the new strategy, about $6 billion of that will be spent on health systems. And when we did an analysis, and in fact, it wasn't us, it was Georgetown and a number of other really smart people, looked at what we were spending in investments in health systems. They analyzed that at a minimum, we're expending about 2 billion of that 6 billion we'll be expending on pandemic preparedness. So I think that's really important in thinking about what actually has to happen at the country level for better prevention, for better preparedness around these things. As we look at the new FIF, we have a number of concerns, and I've been tracking all the questions and the comments. I think we're all very aligned with what we're worried about, and Cecilia and Anton have laid out many of these areas. Let me speak specifically to the Global Fund. Firstly, just in practical terms, what has to happen is that indeed we need a waiver to be an implementing partner of this new FIF. We do find this a little strange because we are a FIF, and when people talk about traditionally FIFs don't have engagement by civil society, and traditionally FIFs don't engage with the private sector, and traditionally FIFs only are managed by the small group of founding donors. Those are new rules that the World Bank put in place a couple of years ago in response to the proliferation of other FIFs. But Gavi, the Global Fund, we were all established 20 years ago as FIFs, continue to be FIFs. So just want to make it clear that those are choices that have been made around exactly what the structures would look like and who can be an implementer and who can't. So over the course of the next few months, we anticipate some kind of review process in order for the Global Fund, Gavi, and CEPI to get a waiver. We've made it clear that we don't think that we're the only ones who should get a waiver, but that's a broader conversation. Right now, we are the most obvious recipients in terms of what we think the FIF wants to do. And so we're working together. We have been doing joint papers to the G20, joint and separate papers to the G20 over the course of the last 2 years. We continue to do that, trying to provide input. We do not have a direct way in. We were participating in the task force that was set up, the Joint Health and Finance Task Force of the G20. We were participating and continue to participate directly as an observer to that task force. We submit papers, we speak. But in terms of the establishment of the FIF, this is pretty much a closed door roundtable of the founding donors. The Global Fund is not invited. We do not have a voice there. And so we are providing input to everyone who is at the table, but we don't have a direct line. Our position remains the same. It's not only about the Global Fund being an implementing entity, it's that we think in order to achieve impact, and I don't have to do too much on this because Anton already did all the work for me, but it needs to have the engagement of all countries. It needs to have CSO and community engagement. It needs to be country driven, and we need to look at national preparedness plans and so on. And we need to ask the questions around what exactly this FIF wants to do. And for us, there's a lot of discussion around the governance, the decision-making amongst the donors. And by the way, I have heard that they might institute a threshold. So it's not just that you have to pay to play. It might be that you have to pay a certain amount in order to play. So I don't think, Anton, that's within GPI principles, but you might be able to enlighten us on that. And so we think that they should really focus on exactly what we want to achieve from this, because there's also a lot of debate about whether it's just countermeasures, whether it's upstream research capacity, or whether it's actually country-based preparedness, strengthening the health systems in country, strengthening the community responses in country. So we would like to see a lot more on what they're trying to achieve, and therefore the governance model should reflect what you're trying to achieve and what your impact should be. That has been our position. We are working right now with Gavi and CEPI to provide further input based on the decisions that the World Bank has just made. But we do think there needs to be a lot of advocacy. There is discussion around, and I know I'm over time, so I'll keep this very brief. There is discussion around having a kind of, investors group, a partner forum, something like that, that would advise, much like the GFAF operates, with the actual decision-making, the financial decision-making happening amongst a smaller group of founding donors. So I do think that we need to be very vocal around what we think is I would say, modern 21st century approach to governance and to actually achieving impact. And I think we have to work together on that. So I want to confirm that we are being very vocal on these issues, but I also want you to be aware that we're not really sitting at the table. So I think working together from all of our different vantage points and reinforcing each other's messages is going to be vital. Maybe, Katie, I'll leave it there because I rather respond to questions.
Yeah, so thanks so much, Diane, and thank you again, Anton. I mean, Diane, I would just point you to a few of the questions that maybe you could address here. We have a few minutes to try and address them orally. It doesn't always work. It does not always work when we try to type in answers, but just to say that, Diane, there's a question for you specifically about speaking more about the World Bank rules that you mentioned that sort of designate what a FIF can look like, which was after the Global Fund's founding. I think it would be interesting if you're able to share any further information, give us a highlight as to sort of when, if that happened, and where we might be able to find more information about that. I also think that there is a question, and sorry, when people answer questions, they get sort of moved around. But, I guess the question would be for the Global Fund, like understanding that you're not a seat at the table and understanding that you're doing your own advocacy in terms of, what is needed. Where is the Global Fund sort of landing in terms of public statements that it's making around this beyond, behind the scenes advocacy, and how do you reconcile sort of participation in this kind of a structure, which is clearly, clearly to many of us anyways, quite flawed, and at the very least needs to be significantly changed in terms of governance, inclusion of more than just the founding funders, in terms of decision making and so on. So Diane, I'm not sure if you're able to look at any of those sort of questions or answer some of them here. That would be helpful. And then Anton, I think we could come back a little bit to you. There seems to be a bit of a conversation around political willingness at the bank, and founding donors, and where you feel like how far away from something that could approach GPI principles do you think we are, and where do you see opportunities, Anton, for us to try and come into that, bring more of that GPI kind of approach when you show the 5 sort of diagrams of what it is and what it isn't. I think it's fairly clear to see that the FIF currently, as it's proposed, would get a failing GPI grade, at least in my books. But Diane, over to you for some comments, and then Anton, if you're able to pop in and answer some of those questions.
I did try and type answers in the Q&A, but you're right, I'm not entirely sure how that works. I am not the expert on the World Bank, so we could probably do some searching on the website. But it's my understanding is that because of the proliferation, Cecilia referred to this, of FIFs over the course of the last few decades, the bank board decided to rein this in a little bit, and they are fiscally conservative and so on. So my understanding, it was driven by concerns around financial responsibilities, etc. And so they put in place a lot more stricter rules around what should constitute a financial intermediary fund for the World Bank that would reduce their risk and exposure. So I think my understanding is that's the framework within which it was done. I think it's again, I'm stating the obvious, but you all know the World Bank is a bank. They think about these things like a bank. So they think like fiduciaries. They don't think about, they're not thinking about health outcomes, and they're not thinking about you know, communities or civil society or anything, they're thinking like a bank. They're thinking about how to channel the money, how to manage the money, how to make sure that they can report back to the investors about where the money has gone. So I think we can't expect an elephant to act like a giraffe. So we do need to make sure that there are other people at the table. We've been saying this to the team at WHO, that they are engaging, but they need to be very vocal about this. Is if pandemic preparedness these are health investments. So there needs to be, that's why I keep saying what exactly the operational objectives will be. What is the impact? What are the indicators that they're expecting to achieve through this fund? You have to work backwards from there to see what has to happen on the ground. What are the regional investments that are needed, and then figure out how the governance will support the flow of financing to those areas. And so I guess I'm making the case for Anton's point about a step back and a proper look at the design to make sure that what it's designed for is to achieve the kind of impact that people are expecting. I do think that the Global Fund governance maybe it could be improved, and certainly it's a big challenge for us to integrate new donors into the Global Fund. But to go backwards and to have decision making made without implementing countries unless they can pay something, and without civil society, does seem to be a rather backward-looking approach, and potentially also undermines the potential effectiveness. We know how important it was to have community engagement and trust during COVID-19, and that doesn't come after the fact, as I think several of you have said in the chat.
Thank you. And Cecilia, I see your hand raised as well. So maybe if you wanted to come in response to that, and I'm just noting that there's some lively Q&A going on in terms of some of this, and just popping some that Cecilia's provided a link to that when those changes were made to sort of the structure of the FIF. And so Cecilia, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I mean, just very quickly, I want to say that I agree with Diane that, the World Bank has a clear role for FIFs. They are a trustee of the money, and they are potentially, if the governing body agrees, an implementing entity, and they will provide, the technical everyday support, but they're not making the decisions or calling the shots. Those are the founding donors. So I think in terms of advocacy, as Diane said, the founding donors need to hear loud and clear that this should not be solely there should be a more inclusive process to setting this up. So I think we are in agreement. I just put the link there with like more of the information in terms of like the changes that were made and the reforms that were made, which I align to what Diane said in terms of the problem with like fiscal responsibility and the proliferation of FIFs, and trying to make sure that there was a clear need for this, instead of just, like saying we have money and then we can establish this. So just to clarify that, and to say that like the pressure needs to go to the founding donors. They are the decision makers, and as soon as that governance body is set up, which will be in September, then they will have the decision-making power. So right now, the weekly conversations are with the founding donors, which are this core design team. So just to clarify that, thanks.
Thanks, appreciate that. I think that clarity in terms of who is making the decisions at the current moment and where advocacy and activism needs to focus is really helpful in terms of getting that clarity. Anton, I just wanted to come back to you just in terms of some of the discussion in the Q&A around the GPI, and whether you had any further thoughts about how GPI principles are stacking up with how the FIF looks now, but also any further reflections based on some of the comments around whether a staged process is feasible, and or how will we go about advocating that to those who are making the decisions right now.
Yeah, so thanks for the questions. I can't answer them all, but what I can reflect on is that we've done this work around GPI principles basically to support advocacy of campaigns. And what we do hope is that these GPI principles are a way of winning a better FIF. a way of making an argument and winning it, because it becomes potentially the solution to making a better FIF if those principles are applied. I think it's useful for us to also be a bit self-reflective in that we're really used to going after the traditional donors, and we're not so used to the engagement at country level when it comes to contributing to global goods. And so I just want to reflect that when we did a piece of work that was actually for CEPI to go, the CEPI in the run up to the last replenishment, we were wondering if a GPI approach would help them with their replenishment. So we spoke to a number of countries in governments and key officials, particularly in South Africa, Malaysia, Indonesia, Mexico. And the thing that was really interesting was how surprised they were to be asked at the beginning of a process about a model that they could contribute to, because they're so used to receiving a ready formed fund or function that they then ask to rubber stamp and endorse. And so what we find is when there is time to engage at country level, whether you're low or middle income country, there's a receptiveness because countries are fed up of a patronizing approach, and no matter what, they see that they've got something to contribute to a better pandemic response. And they've articulated, South Africa's a really good example. We've got M&E capacity, we've actually got public and private investment that would like to be part of a problem and have a stake in determining how the solution is conjured and our stake in that. And so I do think there's a demand for a more grown-up approach that doesn't rely on the donor recipient kind of framing that we're so used to. We're a relatively small team that have been kind of evangelizing around GPI constantly from countries, particularly those that have been middle-income country for quite some time. It's a no-brainer. They already think kind of south-to-south cooperation. They already think working in a different way. So many of them no longer rely on ODA funding. So it's a narrative. It's a thing that they're already thinking. And then what we've heard is, despite the fact that it's a relatively small capacity, that GPI has been spoken about when they're talking about the FIF or with some of the founding kind of donors, like is this useful? But I think it will rely on, for us as advocates, is it a useful framework to push for a better FIF? Ultimately, is it useful for us and for you as a way of pushing for the asks? And mindful that the sense of you need a model that is a grown-up model where all want to contribute. And we've done work. I remember when we did work with Unitaid, which was, and even Global Fund to some extent, is when you encourage middle-income countries, low-income countries to contribute, often it's kind of to show that there's support to then get the other donors to give. But I think even going beyond that, to show support, because then you have a legitimate role in the co-creation. And so I think there's a couple of potential wins. One is if it's useful, use the principles. Two is securing it. I think it's critical to secure a two-phased approach, because there's no way we're going to get what we need in the next 8 weeks before, when it needs to be launched. So, but can we secure a two-phased approach and a commitment to a proper co-created fund? And also I think there's a potential, which is when it comes to founding donors, can we make them realize, I think, as you said, Katie, that it's essential that you have a nothing about us with an approach, a grown up, like an approach that's fit for the century when it comes to creating a new fund. So we don't have basically another bad fund conjured up by a few powerful people that determine what the solution for the world should be. So yeah, that's just some reflections based on those answers.
Thanks, Anton, appreciate it. And Diane, I see your hand raised, so I'm going to go to you, but we do need to wrap this section up so that we can then turn to civil society colleagues who are wanting to talk about the PPPR FIF that we want. So Diane, quickly some reflections from you, and thank you, Anton. I think that's all very helpful context and reflections. Diane.
Thanks, Katie. And just briefly, one thing I did want to say is that when we think about the modalities, I mean, we focused a lot on the governance and the representation, which I completely agree is absolutely crucial, but actually how this thing is going to work and what it's going to fund is really, really important. And if you read the white paper, they're talking about things like submitting proposals on a quarterly basis for funding of implementing entities. That seems to imply breaking it up into tiny little bite-sized pieces that are tightly controlled with different implementing entities, or that go through the bank, through the bank processes for specific investments. So not really recipient driven in any way. And also, quite frankly, the Global Fund will then not be able, we might be approved as an implementing entity, but we wouldn't be able to receive funding from the FIF if that was the modality, because we're not about to give up on our governance principles and our country-driven and inclusive governance. So we wouldn't be able to respond to some governance that gave us a pipeline of a specific project-based funding. So just so that everybody's aware of that. We could be a subsidiarity. So like if we were to receive funding for specific set of indicators that are integrated into our strategy, we could absolutely do it, because then we would run it through our national processes and so on. But I think that's important to keep in mind, and I'm sure that's going to be equally problematic for some of the other implementing entities. Thank you.
Thanks. I think that's really helpful, and as has already been noted in the chat, to note that concern and that challenge in terms of the modalities. And just wanting to say, I think we've had a comment in the chat about how the FIF seems to be constructed on lessons not learned. And I think that's an excellent segue from this session into the next sort of part of this webinar, where we're hoping to talk a little bit with you all about what we want to see, what our priorities are as communities and civil society. Communities, affected communities are not mentioned. That terminology is not even used within this. And that's a significant challenge, as has been noted, in comments and the Q&A and in many of our submissions to the original white paper. So now to sort of, shift our focus a little bit here and move to some other speakers and colleagues from various organizations, I wanted to pass. We're going to go through sort of the speakers we have Cedric Ninina-Hazwe from GNP+, Courtney Howe from STOPAIDS, and Chris Collins from Friends of the Global Fight. And we're going to start with you, Cedric. Welcome, bonjour, welcome to the call. And then Courtney, and then Chris. So we're going to pop some short bios so you know who you're hearing from, and then we're going to have an opportunity for discussion once we get through comments. But Cedric, please talk to us about civil society and community engagement and governance, and your reflections on the conversations and discussions and submissions and active actions to date around this FIF. Cedric, over to you.
Thanks, Katie, and thanks, Cecilia, Anton, and Diana for the interventions. And I think that you all laid the foundation in terms of the concern we have on the PPR FIF. From my side, I think what I would start saying is this PPR FIF has been a concern not only as a process, but also for two main reasons. One of it is that its governance model, as everyone has mentioned it, but also the speed of the process, which in the middle of the way is leaving the engagement of key stakeholders, including even if we don't talk about communities and civil society, including key countries. And think about FIF as a response to any future pandemic, and also FIF as the PPR FIF as also response to the COVID-19 kind of lesson learned, seeing that we need there's a financial gap. It's really worrying to see that we are not learning from COVID-19. We are not learning in terms of how community has been playing an important role at all levels in response to a pandemic. And now we are thinking about setting up a funding which is not engaging the affected community. And then this leads us to think about whether we are really aiming to respond to future pandemic, or if there's probably another kind of agenda that we probably don't see at the moment. And talking about community and the experience, Anton mentioned it, a lot of time. We have been led by nothing for us without us principle. And as I mentioned, if I speak in people living HIV community perspective, we take reference from the 90s, where we start talking about the GPA principle, engagement of people living HIV and AIDS response, and seeing it as an example to respond to any pandemic. If you're not engaging the community, you are not responding to the need of the community. We all know that. And then leading to establish a PPPR FIF that is not engaging properly the community has different implications, not only for community, but also for countries. We also have, in many countries, this is from GNPP's reports, people living HIV were part of many national emergency committee to respond to COVID-19 as one of key stakeholders to be engaged to be able to respond. This is an example of how community system is best placed when we are trying to respond to any pandemic. So these are the concerns that we have, and then I think everyone is saying that this is really becoming problematic, not only because of the engagement is not clear, but also it's getting hard for stakeholders to follow the process with the same speed that is having. Therefore, I'm thinking as a community, I would say as a community member, as a civil society representative, we need to think as the PPPR FIF served a global public response. Then if it's not including all stakeholders, it's not serving a global public response. Anton, and I think also Diana mentioned in terms of a system that has been built from other FIF and how this is working. Our role as a civil society and community need to be actually coordinated from our side, but also we have the responsibility to voice out. I would like to take this opportunity to thank GFAN for organizing this convening, but also calling us to really stay more coordinated and not taking any promises as accomplished until we have it. I saw some of colleagues, we already have support from some countries, including US and the Netherlands, but it is not concrete yet. And we are still discussing whether we can have just a simple seat or a voting seat. And if we take these promises and we don't actually continue to push at the moment, we are being distracted by the same process, and the train is already moving. As you can see, September is not too far. Then my reason of being here is to call more about coordination, but also to link to join our effort and be able to connect with key stakeholders that are being our allies, but also hold these promises that we are getting. Use every single voice we have to get to member state, to get to this delegation, and be able to really articulate, not from organization perspective, but civil society. This is a cause of not for not GNP Plus, not for GFAN, not for any other organization, but we are heading to a place where it's bringing us back into 90s, where we have again to claim space, where we have again to claim, community to be included. So I'm really calling us to be more coordinated, but also to join forces. This is the only way that we can, get the seat into this is the PPPR FIF, but also this is the only way we can meaningfully be engaged. And also this is the only way community that we represent may have a seat and may also have a possibility to push at country level, to be for country delegate to follow, which is maybe something probably colleagues we talk about. We are the one that raising the voice. Some countries are being left behind as well, and they are not raising their voice. So we have the responsibility not only to present the community, but also to make sure that the FIF is not just working for a small group of countries, but is working for everyone, as this is a global, I will call it, it's a global public interest. It's not one's, a country or two countries interest or problem. We have to be more coordinated, and we have to, lead the way to others that are not being able to voice out. Thanks, Katin.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, I hope some background noise here in my house isn't interfering here, but thank you very much, Cedric, for those comments. I think it's a really clarion call for working together, finding ways to collaborate and elevate our voices collectively, so that we can get some of these, sort of clear messages that are, coming in through the Q&A, coming in through the chats. We know the answers to some of these questions. We're asking you to sort of prioritize and rank sort of objectives for us as civil society, not because it needs to be, the final, the final response, but it's helpful for us to be able to figure out, coming out of this call, where we want to place sort of our priorities, and how we find ways to collectively target those founding donors, target and look at the sort of the challenges for different funding modalities like the Global Fund, if things proceed as they are currently planned to, but also the need to talk to and pressure organizations like the Global Fund Secretariat, which has said it doesn't have a space at the table, which is fair enough. That's a challenging space to be in, but the Global Fund has a big voice, as do some of the other multilateral agencies, and should be using that in as public a way as possible to be adding their voices and helping to elevate the messages that I think, not just the messages, but the asks and the requirements that we have in terms of making sure that this FIF doesn't just become another, something else where there's a big pot of money and it seems like it goes into a black hole. But that's maybe a bit too much editorializing from me at the moment. So I want to make sure that we welcome Courtney Howe from STOPAIDS, but also a colleague in the platform for representative civil society and community representatives to the ACT Day. And Courtney was just going to share a few thoughts around some of the lessons from that, and maybe it ties in with the theme of lessons not learned yet from despite two years plus in terms of the ACT Day. Are we learning any lessons in terms of how we're approaching this FIF and other pandemic preparedness modalities coming out of the one that we have been trying to work with for the past 2 years? So Courtney, over to you.
Thank you, Katie. And I'm just going to hopefully share my screen just for 2 slides. And I just want to say, I completely support Cedric's points there around sort of the importance of sort of community participation at all levels throughout the intermediary fund. And this is something I've put on here on the screen, is something that in ACT A we've been calling for from the very beginning. So back in June 2020, the civil society community delegations to the lead agencies, so Global Fund, UNITAID, Gavi, joined by CSEM of UHC 2030, sent this letter calling for ACT A to have that sort of meaningful involvement, formal participation of civil society and communities in both the development and the governance of every level of ACT-A, including the Facilitation Council, but also what at that stage was sort of the 3 pillars, now 4 with the health systems response connector. But we obviously experienced that the ACT-A developed and has continued without a sort of central decision-making governance structure. Instead, now on the WHO website, for example, it's described as a support structure. And that has certainly been one of the biggest challenges, I think, for civil society community meaningful participation in ACT-A, that there isn't a clear decision-making governance structure where we know where we need to be involved in those decisions. And so we're not always at the table when we need to be for that participation to be meaningful, despite the fact that at the moment we have around sort of 50 representatives across the whole ACT-A structure. And that's been a repeated call. So there's a number of letters and statements that we put out, and even to this day, we still call for that sort of clear structure with formal participation, not just of civil society and communities, but also low middle income countries who have largely been excluded from sort of the ACT-A decision-making structure as well. So based on this, and Anton's already mentioned this earlier in the webinar with colleagues, we had 123 organizations join us in submitting sort of recommendations for the FIF to the World Bank, and highlighting, based on our experience in ACT-A, but also in the governance structures of the lead agencies, such as Global Fund, such as UNITAID, these 3 essential elements being sort of formal representation equal to governments in the governance structure of the FIF, having seats that includes both NGOs and communities being at the table, voting rights, and then funding to support engagement with broader civil society and communities, given obviously the large kind of scope of pandemic preparedness and response. And in addition, last month, led by our colleague FIFA Rahman, who's NGO representative on the ACT-A Facilitation Council, we've also been trying to make sure that these lessons learned from ACT-A and again, governance structures of lead agencies, we've put those forward to kind of make the case again, because we're finding with the FIF, we're seeing sort of that opposition sometimes around participation, around this argument around sort of agility, efficiency, a lack of technical expertise, or sort of conflicts of interest. And again, using that experience from ACT-A, we pulled together this document led by FIFA, sort of making that case for representation in the FIF. And for both of these documents, I'll share the link in the chat. And I think just sort of next steps, obviously as ACT-A sort of looks towards the end of its strategy in September, possible transition plan, I think still trying to make sure that we take these lessons from ACT-A forward. And we are at the minute, again, preparing a document around what representation could look like in the FIF, and again, bringing these lessons in from ACT-A. And I will pop an email in the chat. It would be great to connect with colleagues who'd be interested in developing that document as well. Thanks, Katie.
Thanks very much. Appreciate that, and thanks for being, thanks for sharing in terms of this important work. And there has been a lot of important work that has been done. I think, though, that I come back to what Cedric said in terms of finding a way that we are, voicing and collectively elevating our voices together, because we have been saying the same things. We have been saying the right things. And I see that Conte is just giving us a quick look at, this poll. So please do go in. Again, this is not scientific. This is not to limit anyone, but just helpful to gauge you as participants in this today in terms of ranking the objectives that are most important to least important, even though they are probably all very important, just to be clear. Chris Collins from Friends of the Global Fight in the US. I feel like every call I'm on these days, I get the opportunity to speak with you, Chris, but welcome. We'll pop your bio into the chat. We just really wanted to hear from you around some of the work that you're doing as it links to both the, work in the US around the Global Fund and its replenishment, but also in general around global health and these 3 issues and how you're engaging in the PPR FIF and what it is that we want to see collectively. So Chris, please, over to you.
Thank you, Katie. Yeah, and I will be brief. Other folks have laid out the issues brilliantly. I would just say from the DC advocacy community, several of us have weighed in many ways with the US government in terms of their engagement in the FIF. Several people are putting together a joint statement that we hope to get out within a week to the US government, urging them around some core principles. And I think, although it's not final, I think here's what will be in that statement. Basically, the priorities you've been hearing, that the governance structure is inclusive of civil society and low and middle income countries as full voting members. We're going to suggest that the governance model of the Global Fund should be used as a template for the FIF. Insisting that Global Fund and Gavi and others are key implementers in the FIF, that the waiver process that World Bank says is needed should be swift and pro forma for the Global Fund, but also raising the point that, and this is something to get to what Diane said, the modality is important here. The Global Fund needs to be supported to do its country-driven work, not to be micromanaged by a FIF. So the modality is really important here, that we keep the as a considerable amount of the funds flow through the Global Fund, that the Global Fund's allowed to maintain its good principles like community engagement and a focus on health systems and a focus on local decision making. That there needs to be a clear process for how this is going to be additive in terms of global health investments, that we don't cannibalize other priorities. In global health, there had been talk about non-ODA financing, creative new ways of financing. Where is that discussion in this FIF? How is it going to guarantee that we don't cannibalize other global health funding? I mean, another thing that we're going to observe is that there's no pandemic preparedness if we don't have a successful global fund replenishment in September. We need to get to the $18 billion level. As we heard from Diane, a third of those investments go to health systems and building health security. Job number one is a successful global fund replenishment in September. And that is really kind of goes to the larger point that, I think Cedric and others have echoed, that it feels like we've been not learning the lessons of what we all are going through with COVID, that we learned that community systems were essential, that the vertical programs in AIDS, TB, and malaria were absolutely essential in helping countries respond, that community systems were agile and able to pivot and help with COVID, that trust is central in terms of pandemic preparedness, and education and engagement and involvement of community is part of what you do to build trust, and that the Global Fund and Gavi were absolutely central in the response to COVID. There's a proof point on these institutions. Why aren't we starting with them rather than having them be as a second thought? It does not really make a lot of sense to us. And then finally, we're going to really be clear that the FIF needs to prioritize investments in health systems that are able to serve people's needs today and able to identify and respond to new disease threats. So I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. I really appreciate it. And I just wanted to just quickly pass the mic over to Asia Russell, who's joined the call today. And we hadn't previously planned to have her as a speaker, but I think Asia, given the piece that you and Emily Bass published earlier this week, which is my favorite of the week, as I mentioned earlier, but also just, some of the discussion that's been happening in the Q&A around the way that this has been structured gives us an indication of how little those who are actually in power want to change it, right? So given the discussions today, Asia, given your reflections around in that piece, Fix It or Forget It, and in other conversations that you've been having around this, what do you see as the next things, as some of the next steps that we need to be considering taking? Where are our targets, and how do we formulate those asks and make those and apply the pressure that we all know is needed in the next few weeks to at least get some improvements to where this is headed? Asia?
Thanks, Katie. And how many minutes do you want to give me? I want to be respectful of the time we have.
3 or 4 minutes. If you can solve all the problems in 3 or 4 minutes.
If I can be, the people on this call are the smartest people in the world when it comes to designing funds that are accountable to communities. And I want to start with a very quick first point, which follows from what Chris just said. Why aren't we starting from a blueprint of success? It's not because the bank and the founding donors aren't aware of the fund and that success. It's because they have chosen not to, which to me indicates that this is about power and politics, not about evidence And so that's fine. That means that we need to focus more on what rebalances power, what closes our power gap, and maybe less on politely making arguments, or that's necessary but not sufficient. That's what I would argue. Of course, Janet Yellen, Beth Cameron, and others are fully aware of the Global Fund and the way it works. They do not want this to work that way. So we need to show why it's a problem for them if this fund does not work that way. And that's my most important point. To that end, I actually believe in terms of what's next for us between now and September 30th, the issue on governance we need to be very careful about, because I believe that is the bone they will throw to communities. That is the easiest thing for them to do, is here is your seat at the table. We're in a difficult tactical landscape where the founding donors get to decide. People might remember from the transitional working group meetings of the Global Fund 20 years ago, it was founding donors and Crispus Kayongo, may he rest in peace, deciding and determining, and civil society, including my organization, literally had to be pounding on the door from the outside in order to demand that the charter recognize the values and principles that they were describing, and some would say playing lip service to. And that ended up being a very helpful energy, that inside-outside strategy. We need that on steroids right now, because frankly, the World Bank, so that's on governance. So please be careful. It is a wolf in sheep's clothing. I would argue the bigger issue is this fund is in absolute competition with the Global Fund right now. We see that the White House is actually prioritizing direct calls to decision makers around funding the FIF. While, as Chris has pointed out, we have something moving right now that's saving lives. It's called the Global Fund, and it needs to be fully replenished. And Joe Biden is hosting it in just the same amount of time. So unfortunately, our beloved administration has created an own goal. They've created something in diametric tension because there are only so many hours in the day, and there are only so many finance ministers to call about the same pot of ODA. That is unacceptable. They should have had a strategy from the jump to address this. And instead, we're entering very dangerous territory where Ursula von der Leyen, a call is being given to her to prioritize something that is for the future, that is the FIF, versus a commitment to the here and now of the pandemics of today and tomorrow, AIDS, TB, and malaria, which, by the way, are the same communities who need testing, treatment, and vaccines for COVID. So the final point I want to make is something we've talked less about, but is hugely important, and that is what the bank intends to do with these resources. They intend, my understanding, please also let us not be fooled by the waiver mechanism. Of course, it's they've said it's a no-brainer. So again, the question is, why must it be begged for? Because they want us to spend time and energy to beg for it. So even with a waiver, the threat is very real that the Global Fund would be micromanaged, that the Global Fund would be asked to give up some of its own principles around governance and around measuring impact and results, which is unacceptable. I would argue we should be arguing now that we're in an emergency. The $1 billion that's already been raised should be preferentially invested in platforms for pandemic preparedness and response that are ready to go, that are shovel ready, which is the Global Fund. And I would ask us to argue strongly against the bank funding itself with these resources. That is to say, through regional development banks, the Africa Development Bank, other development banks, which is apparently what it intends to do. Why? Because those are institutions that are very untransparent, as Benita has said in the Q&A, but also have zero track record of delivering impact, particularly for health systems and communities in sub-Saharan African countries. They have a horrible track record. And then if you look at the fiasco of pandemic bonds for Ebola that the World Bank just trotted out, they actually have a bad track record. So I'm worried in some that the FIF, unfortunately, has to be looked at through the lens of realpolitik. The bank is trying to get back some relevance in the PPPR space, which they lost through their Ebola missteps. And that leverage is also related to the White House trying to show that it has done something. That's why, Cedric, to your point, the movement is so quick. And they are not only willing to cut corners, they're willing to sew an entire dress that looks nothing like what communities actually need to put on, right? So we need to intervene. I would argue we need to intervene with boldness before September 30th, and then we need to go to the meeting. I imagine it will be on the sidelines of the fall meetings of the World Bank and the IMF. It will be in person. We should be there, and we should demand, frankly, at least this will be our position. If we don't get a seat at the table, we need to tip the table over. Thank you. That's all.
Sorry, I was muted. Sorry about that. Thank you, Asia. You can see in the chat that your comments resonate with a lot of people in terms of, you know, what we need to do. There's comments about needing to make sure that we are, you know, we probably need some kind of a FIF advocacy network, which I hesitate to say, and I'm certainly not suggesting that that's something that we will do coming out of this call, but it's really clear that there's a lot of power dynamics that many of you with the history of sort of the founding of the Global Fund, responses to things like Ebola and other places, you have this and you have an understanding in terms of where the World Bank has placed itself within this conversation as it's evolving now. I know that Chris Collins wanted to come in with a little bit of commentary. So Chris, I'd like to come back to you, but also Cedric and Courtney, if you have anything you wanted to add here to respond to any of the specific questions in either the chat or the Q&A or what Asia's just said, I think that would be really helpful. We are now over time, but we will try to keep this going for another 5 or 10 minutes and hope that as many of you as possible are able to stay, but understand if you cannot. Chris, first to you, and then Cedric and Courtney, if you have further thoughts.
I didn't have additional comments. I'm sorry. I just, totally agree. I mean, we need to be putting our thoughts out now to all of our governments for their engagement with the World Bank and directly to the World Bank. So 100% with that.
Sorry, I must have seen the wrong message. Apologies. There's a lot flying around in the chat. Cedric or Courtney, any comments from either of you?
Just maybe to reiterate what Asia say, I mean, was mentioned in a very direct way that couldn't put. There's a power dynamic, and we are here as community and civil society. We have the voice. We have access to information intelligence. What the strength we have is to, as I said, to join forces. And this is not, again, a personal, a country and only country concern, but it's a public interest. So I'm reiterating the need for us to really join forces and try to better coordinate before it's too late. Thanks.
Thanks. Courtney?
I think I said, Katie, I was just going to say, we kind of do have an informal FIF advocacy group coming together. I will pop the link in the chat and just invite colleagues who would like to join us and discuss the next steps to send me an email and I can add everybody in there. Thank you.
That's great, Courtney. We'll make sure that's reflected in sort of key highlights from the call. Cecilia?
Yes, thank you. And thank you very much for the opportunity to join today and talk about the process. My only comment, and, fully agree with Asia about the boldness and the need to, get a very clear voice, is that, as, just Courtney mentioned about this group, we really need to try to be as informed as we can to put our efforts directly to the things that we know that we can change, because there are some detailed processes that will not. So I just want to make sure that any effort, and all the force that we can put there are really carefully thought of in the areas that really matter for this change that we really want to accomplish. So just with that, offering myself as a resource, and sharing information as needed. So that's all what I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of the speakers and the panelists and to everyone for the really engaging set of questions and answers that's taking place over in the Q&As, as well as the many thoughts that have come through in the chat. Just really appreciate everybody engaging. And as Courtney said, there is a small group. It's primarily based of those organizations that have co-hosted this webinar today, but also there have been other groups and are other groups who are active in that. So we will share that information and make sure that we try to find ways to go forward. Listen, I think that we have a sense of what we need to do. I think we have a sense that that we need to have strong voices that are targeting the key, that we are targeting the key founding donors, and that we are really putting forward a strong analysis of like what can change, why we need it to change, when it needs to change, and the role of the World Bank being something that we saw through just our simple questions today is something that as activists and advocates in health, we have seen so many failures on massive scales in terms of World Bank engagement in health and building and including communities and civil society. This is not something that we can assume is going to somehow be better when it feels clear that the lessons have not been learned, as one of our participants already said. So I'm not leaving this call with all of you with a sense clearly of like, you're going to hear from us in the next 2 days on this, but we are building towards having a further discussion on the sidelines of the IAS, which will be available virtually and not simply to those who are in attendance at the AIDS conference. So we will make sure, and one of the reasons we wanted to do this as a webinar today is so that we got everybody's names and information who's engaged in this, so that we can continue this conversation and find ways urgently to collaborate together. So thank you everyone for today, and people are dropping off, but just really appreciate the thoughts, the perspectives, and the information that was shared. And just we will find ways to keep in touch, and we will find ways that we can do what's needed of all of us in the coming days and weeks, as it's clear that the time is now for action. So thank you all very much for this. Thanks to my co-organizers. And again, thank you to all of the panelists and speakers and to all of you participating. Have a great rest of your days.
Thanks, Katie and Quentin. Great.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.